I am in my bed, laying in the dark, comfortable, rubbing my feet together, and I am scrolling through TikTok, meddling, and I run across a video that leads me down a rabbit hole of a collective of women that believe that women should start women's only communities. And one particular woman said, yeah, all of the wealthy women, I don't know why y'all haven't done this yet. Y'all can take your money and fund the community. And then all of the women who like to build and like to work with animals and they like to grow stuff, y'all can do that. And for all of the stuff that we don't want to do, we can hire a man to come in and do the work that we can't or don't want to do because, ooh, sanitation, who wants to bother with that? But then they have to be from an approved vendors list. And this is going to be so women-centered that we won't even have any male animals in this neighborhood, in this community. It's dumb to think that that would work. And let me tell you why. Number one, some women, most women, not all, but some, got their money from marrying into it or inheriting it. So if you're wanting to build a community that has nothing to do with men, that includes their money. So that's gone. You have no money, no real money anyway. If you think that you can have no animals that are male, how are you going to repopulate your food supply? Cows need bulls. I think it's bulls that impregnate the cows. After y'all eat the cows, how you going to get some new cows? You going to buy it? That doesn't make sense. You need them pregnant, which means you need what? Male animals. If it's nothing but women in his population, in this community, what are you going to do when all those women get old? Because there are no male children and there are no males in the community to get anybody pregnant, to have any new babies. So that means literally this community would just die off eventually. And last but not least, and this is the part that tickles me, y'all believe that men are the only danger when we know that's not true. There are a lot of dangerous women out there, especially behind a man they want.
There is a moment in every long story where the audience realizes the ending is no longer negotiable. The tension has been building for years. The warnings were ignored, and now the consequences are no longer theoretical. What we are witnessing right now between men and women is not a trend, not a phase, and not something that can be reversed with slogans or social campaigns. This is the end result of decades of choices, incentives, and pressure that pushed men away until they finally listened. Stay with me until the end of this video, because what I'm about to lay out is not what you have been told. And once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it. Before we get into it, make sure you like the video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell and select all if you want more Angry Guy content and want to get every single video the moment we release it. It helps the channel, it helps the message spread, and it ensures you do not miss what is coming next. Also, if you want to protect and safeguard your assets and learn how to grow your wealth in an uncertain world, check out Angry's Crypto Academy. Inside the academy, I break down how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly, how to think long-term, and how to position yourself for what is coming. The link is in the description of this video, so go check it out now. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show some support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It is a simple way to help keep the content flowing and the lights on. Now let us get into it. For decades, men were told that they were the problem. Not some men, not bad men, but men as a category. They were told they were outdated, unnecessary, and in the way. They were told that society would be better off if they stepped aside, stayed quiet, and stopped asserting themselves. Masculinity was framed as something to be corrected rather than understood. And male instincts were treated as flaws rather than features that had built and maintained civilizations for thousands of years. Men listened, not because they agreed, but because they were punished when they did not. At first, it was subtle. Cultural messaging, entertainment, education, and media began to shift the tone. Men were portrayed as incompetent, emotionally unaware, or disposable. Boys were taught early that their natural tendencies needed to be restrained, softened, or apologized for. The message was consistent and relentless. You are not needed the way you once were. Your role is over. Move aside. Then it escalated. What began as critique turned into accusation. Ordinary male behavior was reframed as suspicious or threatening. Public spaces became environments where men had to constantly second guess their presence. Simple interactions became risks. Looking in the wrong direction, speaking at the wrong moment, or existing in the wrong place could suddenly be interpreted as a moral failing. Men learned that the safest move was not engagement but withdrawal. All the while, the same voices pushing men away insisted there would be no consequences. They promised independence without cost. They promised freedom without trade offs. They promised that biology, time, and human nature could all be overridden by belief in policy. Men were told they were replaceable, unnecessary, and holding women back. So eventually, men did exactly what they were told to do. They left. What no one seemed prepared for was that men would not leave in anger. They would leave quietly. They would not protest. They would not beg. They would simply stop participating. They stopped pursuing. They stopped initiating. They stopped investing emotionally, financially, and socially in systems that treated them as liabilities instead of contributors. At first, this absence was dismissed. It was called immaturity, bitterness, or avoidance. Men were told they would come back once they grew up, once they got lonely, once they realized they needed relationships. But something unexpected happened. Men discovered that solitude was not the same thing as loneliness. In the absence of constant pressure, judgment, and conflict, many men found something they had not experienced in years: peace. Peace is dangerous to systems that rely on guilt and obligation. A man at peace does not respond to shaming. A man at peace does not chase validation. A man at peace does not sacrifice himself to prove his worth. Once men tasted that peace, it changed the equation permanently. While men were stepping back, women were told a different story. They were told that careers could replace family, that independence could replace partnership, and that time was flexible. They were encouraged to prioritize external achievement above all else, with the promise that relationships could be slotted in later, on demand. The idea that there might be limits was treated as outdated or offensive. Biology was framed as a suggestion rather than a reality. But reality does not negotiate. Time moves forward whether we acknowledge it or not. Choices accumulate whether we celebrate them or not. Eventually, many women found themselves looking around and realizing that the promised future had not materialized. The partners they were told would always be available were no longer there. The men they once dismissed had reorganized their lives without them. Suddenly, the messaging changed. Where men were once told to go away, they were now being asked to return. Where commitment was once framed as optional, it was now framed as urgent. Dating narratives shifted from abundance to scarcity. The tone moved from confidence to concern, but men were no longer listening because they had learned an important lesson. When someone tells you repeatedly that they do not need you, believe them and act accordingly. Men had spent years absorbing criticism, blame, and suspicion. They had been told they were toxic for traits that had once been praised. They had been taught that any assertion of boundaries could be reframed as control. Over time, they adapted by opting out. They focused on their health, their interests, their finances, and their personal routines. Many simplified their lives dramatically. Fewer possessions, fewer obligations, fewer conflicts, more control over their time. This shift did not require ideology, it required pattern recognition. Men observed outcomes and adjusted behavior. They noticed that investing heavily in relationships no longer yielded stability or respect. They noticed that legal and social systems exposed them to risk with limited upside. They noticed that effort was often met with entitlement rather than appreciation. So they stopped playing a game that was structured against them. As economic pressure increased, the contrast became more visible. Many women began to openly discuss how difficult life had become. Costs rose, support systems weakened, expectations remained high, but resources did not. Some demanded that men step back into traditional roles without any restoration of traditional respect. Others expressed confusion about why men were no longer stepping up. But from the male perspective, nothing about the incentives had improved. Men remembered being told they were not needed. They remembered being told to leave women alone. They remembered being told that their contributions were unwanted, unless transactional. They remembered the ridicule and public shaming, and they remembered the peace they found when they stopped trying to meet impossible standards. What we are seeing now is not revenge, it is indifference. Indifference is far more powerful. Men are no longer motivated by anger or resentment. They are motivated by self preservation. They are protecting their energy, their finances, and their mental clarity. They are choosing environments where they are valued or at least left alone. This is why calls for men to return are failing. You cannot summon someone back into a system that offered them no protection, no appreciation, and no stability. You cannot demand sacrifice from people who were taught that sacrifice would be punished. You cannot undo decades of messaging with a sudden change in tone. The relationship between men and women did not break overnight. It fractured slowly through thousands of small interactions, policies, narratives, and incentives. Each one pushed men slightly further away until distance became the default. Now we are at a point where the separation feels permanent because for many men, it is. Men are not waiting for permission anymore. They are building lives that make sense to them. They are defining success on their own terms. They are no longer measuring their worth by external approval. This is why attempts to shame or pressure them back into old roles fail. Those tools only work on people who still seek validation from the system using them. There is an uncomfortable truth here that few want to address. Once men realize that peace is possible without constant negotiation, they do not easily give it up. Once a man experiences life without walking on eggshells, tough times are here. The 9 to 5 is history, and the creator economy is taking over. Join Angry's Creator Academy to learn how to build a thriving online business from scratch with minimal investment. Ditch the daily grind and flourish while others falter. Plus, sign up now and get our online business blueprint free. The Academy is linked in the description below. Go check it out now. Without endless expectation, without constant risk, he becomes very selective about what he allows back in. This is where the conversation becomes difficult because it challenges comforting narratives. It forces a reckoning with the idea that pushing people away has consequences. It forces acknowledgement that independence and interdependence are not the same thing. It forces recognition that you cannot discard half of society and then demand its support when conditions become difficult. Men are not organizing, they are not marching, they are not forming movements in the traditional sense. They are simply opting out, quietly, individually, effectively. And that makes the shift harder to reverse because there is no leader to negotiate with and no policy lever to pull. As conditions continue to tighten economically and socially, this divide will become more obvious. Women who were promised that they could have everything without compromise are discovering that trade offs were always part of the equation. Men who were told they were disposable have learned how to live as if that were true, and in doing so have found unexpected freedom. This is not about hatred, it is about boundaries, it is about consequences. It is about what happens when one side of a relationship is told for decades that they are the problem and eventually decides to stop participating altogether. And this is only the beginning. When people ask how things reached this point, they often look for a single moment or a single policy that broke everything. That is a mistake. What happened unfolded slowly through incentives that rewarded certain behaviors and punished others, through narratives that sounded empowering on the surface but carried hidden costs underneath. Over time, those incentives reshaped how people interacted with one another. Men did not wake up one day and decide to disengage from society. They adapted step by step to an environment that made participation increasingly risky and unrewarding. For a long time, men were told that their role was to provide, protect, and sacrifice. But they were also told that those contributions were no longer special, no longer necessary, and no longer appreciated. This contradiction mattered. You cannot tell someone they are obligated to give while also telling them they are replaceable and morally suspect. Eventually, that contradiction resolves itself, and it resolves in only one direction. People stopped giving. Many men tried to adjust. They tried to soften their language, limit their presence, and second guess their instincts. They tried to navigate a world where the rules kept changing and where intentions no longer mattered as much as interpretations. But the goalposts never stopped moving. What was acceptable one year became unacceptable the next. What was praised in private could be criticized in public. Men learned that there was no stable ground to stand on, and instability is exhausting. Over time, exhaustion turns into disengagement. Men stopped debating narratives that painted them as villains. They stopped defending themselves against accusations that were vague but powerful. They stopped trying to explain their perspective to people who had already decided they were wrong. Instead, they redirected their energy inward. They invested in skills, routines, and lifestyles that reduced their exposure to chaos. This is where the misunderstanding often occurs. Critics assume that men walking away are angry or bitter. In reality, many are calmer than they have ever been. The anger burned out years ago. What replaced it was clarity, clarity about what they can control and what they cannot, clarity about which environments reward effort and which punish it, clarity about the fact that no one is entitled to their time, attention, or resources. As men withdrew, the cultural feedback loop intensified. Media narratives doubled down. They framed male withdrawal as proof of selfishness or immaturity. They insisted that men owed participation to society, relationships, and systems that had shown little concern for male well being. But these arguments fell flat because they relied on moral pressure without offering tangible benefits in return. You cannot guilt someone into caring about a system that has already demonstrated it does not care about them. Meanwhile, many women were encouraged to interpret male withdrawal as defiance rather than adaptation. Instead of asking why men were leaving, they were told to demand that men return. They were told that men needed to be re educated, reshaped, or incentivized back into compliance. This approach failed because it misunderstood the nature of the shift. Men were not rebelling, they were opting out. Opting out changes everything. When someone opts out, they are no longer invested in winning arguments or proving points. They are focused on minimizing loss. Men learned that solitude allowed them to keep more of their income, protect their time, and avoid legal and emotional entanglements that carried asymmetric risk. They discovered that peace is not loud, but it is addictive. Another factor that cannot be ignored is trust. Trust eroded steadily. Men watched as social norms encouraged public exposure, online shaming, and reputational destruction over misunderstandings or accusations that required little evidence to spread. They learned that a single clip, post, or allegation could undo years of effort. In that environment, the rational response is caution, not engagement. Trust also eroded in relationships. Men noticed patterns where effort was expected, but appreciation was conditional, where standards applied one way, but not the other, where accountability was uneven. Over time, they internalized a simple rule: if the cost of participation outweighs the benefit, withdraw. As men withdrew, women began to experience the downstream effects. Dating became more competitive, attention became scarcer, expectations collided with reality. Many women had been told that men would always pursue, always adapt, and always be there when they were ready. But men were no longer operating on that script. They had rewritten it for themselves. This created confusion. Some women responded by doubling down on demands, assuming that firmer language would restore old dynamics. Others expressed frustration and disbelief, asking where all the good men had gone. But from the male perspective, nothing mysterious had happened. Men went where they were treated with neutrality or respect, even if that place was solitude. One of the most important shifts here is that men no longer see relationships as the central pillar of their identity. Previous generations of men were socially conditioned to derive purpose from partnership, family, and external approval. Today, many men are building purpose around autonomy, competence, and personal fulfillment. That change alone alters the entire dating landscape. Men have also become more aware of long term consequences. They have watched peers navigate costly separations, prolonged legal disputes, and emotional burnout. They have observed how quickly admiration can turn into obligation and how obligation can turn into resentment. These observations did not require ideology, they required only attention. In response, men simplified. They reduced their exposure to risk. They chose predictable routines over chaotic dynamics. They focused on health, finances, and hobbies that offered measurable returns. This is why many men walking away appear content rather than desperate. They are not waiting to be rescued from loneliness, they have already adapted. The idea that men are missing out does not resonate with men who feel relief. Relief from constant negotiation, relief from being evaluated against shifting standards, relief from being told they are both privileged and disposable at the same time. Once relief sets in, it becomes very difficult to persuade someone to re enter the environment that caused the stress in the first place. Another uncomfortable reality is that many men realize they were never allowed to fail safely. When men struggle, they are often met with judgment rather than support. When women struggle, society mobilizes resources, sympathy, and advocacy. Men notice this difference. They learned that self reliance was not just encouraged, but required. That realization hardened into a survival strategy. Men stopped expecting external help or validation. They built internal frameworks instead. They stopped asking for permission to define success. They stopped waiting for approval to live the lives they wanted. This shift is subtle, but it is powerful because it removes leverage from systems that rely on male participation without male consent. As this pattern continues, we are seeing a generational divide. Younger men are observing older men and adjusting earlier. They are delaying or avoiding commitments that previous generations rushed into. They are more cautious, more analytical, and less willing to gamble their future on promises that cannot be enforced. This does not mean men reject relationships entirely. It means they approach them differently. They are more selective. They demand reciprocity. They walk away at the first sign of instability rather than trying to fix everything themselves. They no longer see endurance as virtue in environments that do not reward it. What makes this moment particularly significant is that it coincides with economic pressure. Rising costs, unstable employment, and shrinking safety nets amplify every decision. In such conditions, people prioritize survival and stability. Men, having already adapted to self reliance, are often better positioned to weather these pressures alone than in high conflict partnerships. This is why appeals to emotion are failing. You cannot appeal to nostalgia when the present feels calmer than the past. You cannot invoke obligation when obligation previously led to loss. You cannot promise future rewards when past rewards never arrived. Men are not being stubborn, they are being rational. At the same time, many women are encountering a reality they were not prepared for. Independence requires resilience, support networks, and long term planning. It is not just about freedom, it is about responsibility. For those who were told that partnership was optional and time was flexible, the adjustment can be jarring. But here is the critical point: men are not responsible for resolving that adjustment. They are not obligated to sacrifice their stability to compensate for narratives they did not create. They are not required to re enter systems that penalize them simply because others are now uncomfortable with the outcome. This does not mean reconciliation is impossible. It means it cannot be coerced. Any future realignment would require trust, respect, and incentives that align with reality rather than ideology. It would require acknowledging mistakes rather than denying consequences. It would require creating environments where men feel safe to invest again. So far, those conditions do not exist at scale. And until they do, the pattern will continue. Men will remain cautious, they will remain selective, they will remain focused on preserving the peace they fought quietly to obtain. To understand why this divide accelerated so quickly, you have to look at the role technology played in reshaping expectations. Social media did not create these dynamics, but it magnified them. It compressed decades of social change into a few short years and rewarded behavior that was loud, emotional, and attention seeking. Platforms optimized for engagement do not favor nuance or long term thinking. They favor extremes, and extremes distort perception. For many women, social media created the illusion of endless options. Attention was abundant, validation was constant, and comparison became unavoidable. A small percentage of highly visible men received disproportionate focus, while the majority of men became increasingly invisible. This created a mismatch between perceived value and real world outcomes. Online attention felt like leverage, but leverage disappears the moment it is tested in reality. Men noticed this early. They saw how attention was distributed and how easily it was withdrawn. They observed how quickly admiration could turn into criticism and how public approval could vanish overnight. For men who value stability, this was a warning sign. Systems that reward volatility are not systems you invest your life in. Dating apps further intensified this imbalance. They reduced complex human interactions into swipe based judgments that prioritized appearance and instant appeal. For many men, the experience was demoralizing and transactional. Effort was rarely reciprocated. Conversations were fleeting. Standards escalated while commitment declined. Over time, men stopped interpreting this as personal failure and began seeing it as structural design. Once men understood the design, many disengaged. They recognized that the system was not built to foster connection for them. It was built to keep users cycling through hope and disappointment. Men who opted out did not feel like they were missing out. They felt like they were escaping a loop that offered diminishing returns. At the same time, social media normalized public shaming and performative outrage. Private conflicts became content, disagreements became spectacles, accountability became selective. Men learned that privacy was no longer guaranteed, and discretion was no longer respected. In that environment, caution is not paranoia, it is common sense. As these dynamics intensified, traditional courtship norms eroded. Clear roles were replaced with ambiguity. Expectations were high, but boundaries were unclear. Men were expected to lead without authority, provide without recognition, and commit without security. These contradictions created constant friction, and friction drains energy. Men began to ask practical questions rather than ideological ones. What do I gain from this interaction? What do I risk? What happens if things go wrong? These questions do not arise in healthy systems. They arise when trust has been compromised repeatedly. Another accelerating factor was the way institutions responded to male disengagement. Instead of addressing root causes, many doubled down on moralizing language. Men were told they were broken, immature, or afraid. But insults are not incentives. They do not inspire participation, they confirm withdrawal. Meanwhile, the narrative that women could have it all without compromise remained largely unchallenged. The idea that time, biology, and partnership dynamics might impose limits was treated as offensive rather than factual. This left many women unprepared for the realities they would face later. And resentment grows quickly when expectations collide with outcomes. Men watched this unfold from a distance. They were no longer emotionally invested in correcting misconceptions. They had already adjusted their lives. They focused on stability, predictability, and peace. These priorities shaped their daily decisions: where to live, how to work, how to spend money, how to structure their time. One of the most misunderstood aspects of men walking away is that it is not primarily about rejecting women. It is about rejecting chaos. Men are not allergic to relationships, they are allergic to environments where effort is punished and boundaries are ignored. When relationships feel like liabilities rather than partnerships, withdrawal becomes logical. This is why attempts to shame men back into participation consistently fail. Shame only works when people care about the approval of those shaming them. Men who have opted out no longer do. They are not trying to win arguments, they are trying to protect their equilibrium. Another important piece of this puzzle is how men experience purpose. Purpose does not require constant validation. It requires competence, autonomy, and progress. Many men discovered they could build purpose without romantic involvement. They found fulfillment in mastery, creativity, physical health, and financial independence. And these pursuits provided tangible feedback and personal satisfaction. Once a man builds a life he enjoys, his tolerance for disruption decreases. He becomes selective about what he allows into that life. This is not fear, it is discernment. It is the natural outcome of experience. As this shift continues, it exposes a deeper societal issue. Modern culture often celebrates freedom without responsibility and empowerment without accountability. But systems built on imbalance eventually collapse under their own weight. Relationships are no different. When one side is encouraged to demand without reciprocating, the other side eventually disengages. Men are not obligated to rescue systems that failed them. They are not required to subsidize narratives that dismiss their value. They are not responsible for correcting outcomes they warned about years in advance. These truths are uncomfortable, but discomfort does not make them untrue. There is also a biological component that is often ignored in public discourse. Men and women are different in how they experience time pressure. Men tend to build value gradually through competence and experience. Women face a narrower window for certain life goals. Pretending these realities do not exist does not eliminate their impact. It only delays recognition until options are limited. When recognition arrives late, it often comes with urgency and frustration. But urgency does not create attraction. Frustration does not rebuild trust. And pressure does not inspire commitment. Men who have structured their lives around peace are unlikely to abandon it under emotional demands. Another layer to this story is the erosion of community. In previous generations, extended families, religious institutions, and local networks helped stabilize relationships. Today, many of those structures are weaker or absent. This places enormous pressure on romantic partnerships to fulfill every emotional and social need. When those partnerships fail, isolation increases. Men responded to this by building smaller, more controlled social circles, a few trusted friends, solitary routines, online communities focused on shared interests rather than emotional dependency. These networks may be quieter, but they are more predictable. Women, on the other hand, were often encouraged to view community as optional. assuming independence would compensate. When independence proved more demanding than advertised, the absence of support became apparent. But rebuilding community is harder than maintaining it, especially when trust has eroded. As economic conditions tighten further, these differences will become more pronounced. Scarcity changes priorities, it exposes inefficiencies, it forces people to evaluate what truly adds value to their lives. Men who have already simplified are better positioned to adapt. Those who rely on external validation and unstable systems will struggle more. This is not a celebration of suffering, it is an observation of cause and effect. Choices have consequences. Incentives shape behavior. Narratives influence expectations. When those elements align poorly, outcomes follow predictably. The future of relationships will depend on whether society is willing to confront these realities honestly, not with slogans, not with blame, but with structural change. That means redefining partnership as reciprocal rather than extractive. It means restoring trust through consistency rather than rhetoric. It means acknowledging that men are not defective women and women are not interchangeable men. Without those changes, the current pattern will persist. Men will continue opting out. Women will continue expressing confusion and frustration. Institutions will continue issuing moral appeals that fall on deaf ears. And the gap will widen quietly, without dramatic collapse, but with steady disengagement. What makes this moment unique is that it is happening globally and simultaneously. Technology synchronized experiences that once varied by culture and location. Men across different societies are observing similar patterns and reaching similar conclusions. That convergence suggests this is not a fringe phenomenon, it is a systemic response. As this disengagement becomes more visible, a familiar response emerges from institutions and commentators who built their authority on the old model. They insist that men must be guided back, encouraged back, or corrected back into participation. But this framing misses a critical reality. Men did not leave because they lacked guidance. They left because the guidance consistently led them into instability, loss, and disrespect. Repeating the same instructions louder does not change the outcome. It only confirms that nothing fundamental has changed. What men learned, often the hard way, is that systems do not reward intention. They reward outcomes. A man can have the best intentions in the world, but if the system penalizes him regardless, intention becomes irrelevant. Over time, men stopped judging themselves by narratives and started judging systems by results. When results were consistently negative, they withdrew. This shift toward outcome based thinking is one of the most important developments of the last decade. It represents a move away from emotional obligation and toward rational self assessment. Men began asking whether their effort produced stability, growth, and peace. When the answer was no, they adjusted. That adjustment was not ideological, it was practical. As men became more pragmatic, they also became less persuadable by abstract moral claims. Appeals to duty, sacrifice, or social responsibility lost their power because they were no longer paired with protection or reciprocity. Men noticed that responsibility was expected of them, but responsibility for outcomes was rarely shared. When things went wrong, blame flowed in one direction. This asymmetry eroded goodwill. Goodwill is not infinite. It must be replenished through fairness and appreciation. Once depleted, it does not regenerate simply because someone demands it. Men did not wake up resentful, they became indifferent. Indifference is what happens when goodwill runs out. Another factor accelerating this trend is the way modern culture treats failure. Failure is tolerated, even celebrated, when it fits certain narratives. But male failure is often treated as personal deficiency rather than situational outcome. Men who struggle are told to work harder, adapt faster, or disappear quietly. That message was heard loud and clear. So men adapted in ways that reduced exposure to failure altogether. They chose paths with clearer rules, measurable progress, and fewer interpersonal landmines. Careers with defined expectations, lifestyles with predictable costs, hobbies with direct feedback. These choices created a sense of control that was often absent in relational environments. As men gained control over their lives, their threshold for uncertainty dropped. They became less willing to gamble years of effort on relationships that could unravel without warning. This does not mean men fear commitment, it means they demand symmetry. If risk is shared, investment makes sense. If risk is unilateral, withdrawal is rational. At the same time, many women found themselves confronting a different kind of uncertainty. The assumption that partnership would be available later collided with the reality that timing matters, not because of ideology, but because of human nature. Attraction, energy, and opportunity do not remain static over time. When expectations are built on the idea that they do, disappointment is inevitable. This disappointment often manifests as frustration directed outward. It is easier to blame men for not showing up than to question the narratives that promised everything without cost. But blame does not rebuild bridges, it deepens divides. Men who hear blame after years of withdrawal hear confirmation, not invitation. One of the most striking aspects of the shift is how quiet it is. There are no grand declarations, no formal exits. Men simply stop participating in ways that once defined adulthood. They delay marriage, they avoid long term cohabitation, they minimize legal entanglements, they keep finances separate. Each decision makes sense on its own. Together, they represent a structural transformation. This transformation also changes how men perceive value. Value is no longer measured by how much they provide to others, but by how well their lives function. Peace becomes the metric, stability becomes the goal, simplicity becomes the advantage. These priorities do not align with systems that thrive on constant engagement and emotional volatility. As more men adopt this mindset, social expectations begin to shift. The assumption that men will always step up, pay, pursue, and provide weakens. Some interpret this as collapse, others see it as correction. Regardless of interpretation, the behavior is changing. And another layer of complexity is generational observation. Younger men are watching older men closely. They see the outcomes of choices made under different assumptions. They see the costs of long term commitments entered into without safeguards. They learn vicariously. This observational learning accelerates disengagement. When younger men decide earlier to prioritize autonomy and caution, the system loses future participants before it can adjust. This creates a feedback loop where declining participation reinforces declining incentives, further discouraging engagement. Institutions often respond to this with messaging campaigns rather than reform. They emphasize the importance of relationships without addressing the conditions that made relationships unattractive. They promote inclusion without offering protection. They encourage vulnerability without guaranteeing safety. These mismatches undermine credibility. Men notice credibility gaps. They are sensitive to inconsistency. When words and outcomes diverge, trust erodes, and trust, once broken repeatedly, is not restored through repetition. Another, often overlooked factor is that men are discovering fulfillment outside traditional markers of success. They find satisfaction in competence, health, and mastery. They enjoy solitude not because they dislike people, but because solitude allows focus. Focus leads to progress. Progress reinforces self respect. Self respect changes everything. A man with self respect does not tolerate disrespect for the sake of belonging. He does not accept chaos as the price of intimacy. He does not trade peace for approval. These are not extreme positions, they are boundaries learned through experience. As these boundaries solidify, men become less reactive. They do not argue as much. They do not explain themselves as often. They do not seek validation from people who cannot offer it. This calm withdrawal is often misinterpreted as apathy or avoidance, but it is neither. It is resolution. Resolution marks a point of no return for many. Once a man resolves to prioritize his well being, he does not easily reverse course. He may form relationships, but only under conditions that align with his values. He will walk away quickly from anything that threatens his equilibrium. This selectivity is sometimes framed as entitlement. In reality, it is the opposite. It is restraint. It is the refusal to demand from others what they cannot or will not provide. It is the recognition that compatibility matters more than ideology. As compatibility becomes central, mass narratives lose influence. Men are less swayed by what society says they should want and more focused on what actually works. This pragmatic orientation spreads quietly through peer conversations, online forums, and lived example. Women, meanwhile, are navigating a landscape shaped by these changes. Some adapt by recalibrating expectations and seeking reciprocity. Others resist, clinging to narratives that no longer align with reality. Adaptation leads to connection. Resistance leads to frustration. The outcomes diverge accordingly. It is important to note that this is not a battle between men and women. It is a misalignment between narratives and incentives. When incentives change, behavior follows. Men are not withholding participation out of spite. They are responding to incentives that no longer reward engagement. This is why attempts to frame the situation as a moral failing miss the point. Morality does not override incentives, it operates within them. If moral appeals ignore material realities, they fail. Men have learned this lesson through experience. As we look ahead, the implications extend beyond dating and relationships. Workforce participation, community involvement, and civic engagement are all affected when large numbers of men disengage. Men who do not feel valued in personal relationships are less likely to invest emotionally in collective institutions. This does not mean men disappear from society. It means they interact differently. They contribute selectively. They avoid environments that demand sacrifice without offering respect. This selective participation reshapes social structures over time. The question is not whether this trend will continue. It already is. The question is whether institutions will adapt to the new reality or continue appealing to a past that no longer exists. Adaptation requires honesty. Honesty requires acknowledging mistakes. That is often the hardest step. For meaningful change to occur, trust must be rebuilt. Trust is rebuilt through consistency, fairness, and accountability, not through slogans, not through pressure. Men will not return to systems that have not demonstrably changed. They do not need promises, they need proof. Until that proof exists, men will continue choosing peace. They will continue simplifying their lives. They will continue prioritizing stability over validation. And they will continue opting out of environments that do not respect their boundaries. If there is any chance of meaningful change, it begins with an honest examination of incentives rather than emotions. Men do not respond to slogans, they respond to environments. When an environment consistently produces stress, risk, and loss, people adapt away from it. When an environment offers stability, respect, and predictability, people move toward it. This is not ideology, it is human behavior. For decades, The dominant message was that men needed to change in order for society to function better. Very little attention was paid to whether society itself needed to change in order to function with men. That imbalance mattered. Reform cannot be one directional. If it is not reform, it is extraction. Men are not asking for control or dominance. They are asking for clarity and fairness, clear expectations, clear boundaries, clear consequences that apply equally. Without those elements, commitment becomes a gamble rather than a partnership. And rational people limit their exposure to gambles with asymmetric risk. One of the most significant barriers to reform is the refusal to acknowledge male experience without filtering it through ideology. Men are often told what they feel instead of being asked. Their concerns are reframed as insecurity. Their boundaries are reframed as fear. Their withdrawal is reframed as failure. This framing prevents dialogue because it starts from dismissal rather than curiosity. For trust to rebuild, men must see that their experiences are recognized as legitimate rather than pathologized. That does not mean agreeing with every complaint. It means acknowledging patterns instead of denying them. Men do not need flattery, they need honesty. Another requirement for reform is the restoration of mutual accountability. Relationships cannot function when accountability flows in only one direction. When one side is encouraged to externalize responsibility while the other is expected to internalize it, resentment grows. Over time, resentment erodes cooperation. Men learn this lesson through repetition. They learn that they were expected to adjust endlessly while standards applied selectively. They learned that their sacrifices were assumed rather than appreciated. Eventually, they stopped offering what was taken for granted. Reform also requires a cultural shift away from performative outrage and toward private resolution. Men do not thrive in environments where every mistake can become public spectacle. Privacy is not secrecy, it is psychological safety. Without safety, vulnerability is reckless, not brave. Many men learn to associate vulnerability with exposure rather than support. When vulnerability leads to judgment, withdrawal follows. Rebuilding trust means demonstrating consistently that vulnerability will not be weaponized. Another often overlooked requirement is respect for male time horizons. Men tend to evaluate decisions based on long term outcomes rather than immediate validation. When short term gratification is prioritized over long term stability, men disengage. They see where that road leads. Reform cannot be rushed. Urgency, driven by discomfort, does not produce lasting change. Men are wary of sudden reversals in tone because they have seen them before. They have learned to wait and observe rather than react. Observation is a form of caution, not hostility. Men are watching to see whether actions align with words. They are watching whether boundaries are respected or tested. They are watching whether accountability is shared or deflected. Until consistent patterns emerge, many men will remain on the sidelines. They are not in a hurry. Peace has slowed their internal clock. When urgency disappears, pressure loses its power. Another element of reform is the acknowledgement that attraction cannot be negotiated. You cannot legislate desire. You cannot shame people into genuine connection. Attempts to do so only increase resistance. Attraction grows in environments of trust, polarity, and mutual respect. It withers under pressure and obligation. Men who have opted out understand this intuitively. They know that forced participation produces hollow relationships. They would rather have fewer connections that are authentic than many that are transactional. This selectivity challenges mass dating narratives built on volume and choice. Men are moving away from quantity toward quality. They are uninterested in competing for attention in crowded digital marketplaces. They prefer clarity over chaos. For women who adapt to this reality, opportunities still exist. Reciprocity is magnetic. Calm attracts calm. Respect invites respect. But these qualities must be embodied, not demanded. For women who resist adaptation, frustration will likely increase. The old assumptions no longer hold. Men are not lining up to prove their worth. They are already living lives that make sense to them. Another aspect of reform is economic realism. Financial stability matters. Men are acutely aware of costs. They have seen how quickly obligations can outpace resources. They are cautious about entanglements that could compromise their future security. This caution is often misinterpreted as stinginess or fear. In reality, it is strategic restraint. Men are not unwilling to provide. They are unwilling to provide into systems that lack reciprocity and protection. Legal and institutional frameworks also play a role. When outcomes are unpredictable and consequences are severe, participation declines. Men do not require guarantees. They require proportionality. Risk should be matched by reward. Responsibility should be matched by authority. Without reforms that address these imbalances, appeals to emotion will continue to fail. Men have learned that emotional appeals often precede demands rather than partnership. Another requirement for change is the rebuilding of community beyond romantic relationships. When community weakens, pressure concentrates. Relationships become overloaded. Expectations become unrealistic. Failure becomes more likely. Men responded to community erosion by building micro communities or opting for solitude. Both reduce dependence, both increase resilience, both decrease tolerance for dysfunction. Rebuilding community would require investment, patience, and humility. It would require moving away from individualism without replacing it with coercion. It would require shared responsibility rather than moral hierarchy. This is difficult work, and difficulty is often avoided, but avoidance carries its own costs. The longer reform is delayed, the more entrenched disengagement becomes. Another critical element is the reevaluation of messaging directed at young men. Boys are paying attention. They are watching how men are treated. They are internalizing lessons early. If they see that participation leads to penalty rather than reward, they will choose alternatives sooner. This generational shift matters. Once disengagement becomes normalized, reversing it becomes exponentially harder. Habits formed early solidify quickly, and men who grow up seeing autonomy as default will not view partnership as necessary for adulthood. They will view it as optional. Optional things must compete with existing satisfaction. They must add value rather than demand sacrifice. This changes the negotiation entirely. Relationships must become additive rather than extractive. They must offer peace rather than promise it. They must function well in reality, not just in theory. Many current narratives struggle with this transition because they were built on assumptions that no longer apply. Assumptions about scarcity of male options, assumptions about inevitability of male pursuit, assumptions about obligation replacing desire. Those assumptions are dissolving quietly. Men are discovering that they have options beyond the scripts they were handed. Those options may not be glamorous, but they are stable. Stability is underrated until it is lost. As stability becomes the priority, men will continue making choices that protect it. They will invest cautiously. They will withdraw quickly from dysfunction. They will prioritize environments that allow them to be themselves without constant defense. This does not mean men reject intimacy. It means they reject instability. It means they are no longer willing to subsidize chaos for the sake of conformity. The path forward exists, but it requires abandoning comforting myths. It requires acknowledging that independence has costs. It requires recognizing that biology matters. It requires rebuilding trust through behavior rather than rhetoric. Until those changes occur, men will continue doing what they have learned to do best: adapt, simplify, withdraw, thrive quietly. As these individual choices scale across millions of men, the broader structure of society begins to shift in subtle but undeniable ways. Family formation slows, marriage rates decline, birth rates fall. These are not isolated statistics, they are signals. They reflect changes in incentives, expectations, and perceived risk. When men disengage from traditional pathways, downstream systems feel the impact whether they acknowledge it or not. Housing markets adjust first. Smaller households become more common. Men prioritize spaces that serve function rather than symbolism. They choose efficiency over display. This alters demand patterns, reshaping neighborhoods and urban planning. Developers respond to what sells, not to nostalgia. Over time, the physical layout of society adapts to the lives people are actually living rather than the lives they are expected to live. Labor markets shift as well. Men who disengage from social expectations often recalibrate their relationship with work. They prioritize flexibility, autonomy, and sustainability over status. They are less willing to sacrifice health and time for prestige alone. This does not mean they lack ambition. It means ambition is redirected toward goals that offer personal control rather than external validation. As more men adopt this mindset, employers notice. Traditional incentives lose effectiveness. Loyalty based on identity weakens. Loyalty based on fair exchange remains. Work becomes transactional in a healthy sense. Clear expectations, clear compensation, clear boundaries. When those elements are present, engagement increases. When they are absent, disengagement follows. Civic participation also changes. Men who feel disconnected from personal relationships often feel disconnected from institutions. Voting, volunteering, and community involvement decline when people perceive that their contribution does not matter or is taken for granted. This is not apathy, it is withdrawal from systems perceived as unresponsive. This withdrawal creates feedback loops. Institutions respond to declining participation by centralizing authority rather than rebuilding trust. Centralization increases distance. Distance reduces accountability. Accountability gaps accelerate disengagement. The cycle reinforces itself quietly. One of the most significant long term effects is cultural fragmentation. When shared narratives lose credibility, people retreat into smaller identity groups. Men form subcultures based on values rather than demographics. These subcultures prioritize self reliance, mutual respect, and low drama interaction. They are not hostile, they are selective. Selectivity reshapes norms. Behaviors once tolerated for the sake of harmony are no longer accepted. Boundaries tighten. Expectations become explicit. This clarity reduces conflict within groups but increases distance between groups. The social fabric becomes looser but more honest. Women navigating this environment face a choice: adapt to the new norms of reciprocity and restraint, or cling to narratives that assume automatic male participation. Adaptation leads to connection with a smaller but more stable pool of men. Resistance leads to frustration and blame. Outcomes diverge accordingly. It is important to emphasize that none of this requires hostility. Men are not organizing against women. They are reorganizing their lives around values that protect them from repeated harm. This distinction matters. It explains why shaming fails. You cannot shame someone out of a position they did not adopt emotionally. You cannot guilt someone into abandoning peace. As time passes, memory fades. Younger generations do not remember a world where male participation was assumed. They grow up seeing autonomy as normal. They internalize caution as wisdom. By the time institutions attempt reform, the baseline has already shifted. This generational normalization is critical. It means disengagement is no longer reactive, it becomes proactive. Men do not withdraw because something went wrong. They never enter environments that look unstable in the first place. Prevention replaces recovery. Prevention changes negotiation. You cannot negotiate with someone who is content not playing. You must offer something genuinely better than their current state. For many men, that bar is high because their current state is peaceful, affordable, and predictable. Peace is often misunderstood as emptiness. It is not. Peace is the absence of constant tension. It is the ability to think clearly. It is the freedom to allocate energy intentionally. Once experienced, it recalibrates desire. This recalibration has profound implications for intimacy. Intimacy becomes optional rather than compulsory. Optional intimacy must compete with solitude. It must add value rather than fill a void. This raises standards for behavior rather than appearance. Men become less tolerant of manipulation, inconsistency, and emotional volatility. They recognize patterns quickly and exit early. This efficiency is not cruelty, it is learned discernment. For those women who meet men at this level, relationships can still form and thrive. They tend to be quieter, more private, and less performative. They are built on shared routines rather than grand gestures. They do not look impressive online, but they function well in reality. These relationships do not conform to mass narratives, which is why they are often overlooked. They do not generate controversy. They do not require constant affirmation. They are stable because they are grounded in reality rather than expectation. Meanwhile, mass culture continues to struggle with the mismatch. It produces content expressing confusion, frustration, and demand. It asks why men are not stepping up without examining why men stepped away. It focuses on symptoms rather than causes. Addressing causes requires humility. It requires admitting that certain ideas were oversold and underexamined. It requires acknowledging that social engineering has limits. People adapt in ways that preserve their well being regardless of ideological intent. Men adapted by simplifying. That simplicity is not regression, it is optimization. It strips life down to essentials and removes unnecessary stressors. In a complex world, simplicity is a competitive advantage. As economic volatility increases, this advantage compounds. Men with low overhead, minimal obligations, and flexible routines weather uncertainty better. They are less exposed to shocks. They recover faster. They sleep better. This resilience further reduces incentive to re engage with high risk systems. Why trade stability for volatility? Why trade peace for uncertainty? These questions answer themselves. The longer this pattern persists, the more difficult reversal becomes. Habits solidify, expectations adjust, infrastructure adapts. What once seemed temporary becomes structural. This does not mean society collapses, it means it transforms. Transformations are uncomfortable because they expose outdated assumptions. Those assumptions often feel moral rather than practical, which makes them harder to relinquish. One such assumption is that men will always respond to need. Historically, men did step in during crises, but those responses were grounded in respect, gratitude, and shared purpose. When those elements erode, so does motivation. Men are not indifferent to suffering, they are indifferent to manipulation. They will help when help is meaningful and appreciated. They withdraw when help is demanded as obligation rather than requested as partnership. This distinction matters. Obligation breeds resentment. Partnership fosters cooperation. The difference lies in tone, structure, and expectation. Another assumption being challenged is that social pressure can replace trust. It cannot. Pressure produces compliance at best and withdrawal at worst. Trust produces voluntary investment. Voluntary investment is what sustained systems rely on. Rebuilding trust requires time and consistency. It requires restraint rather than reaction. It requires demonstrating change rather than announcing it. Men are watching for patterns, not promises. Patterns emerge slowly. They require patience. Many institutions lack patience because discomfort feels urgent, but urgency often leads to shortcuts, and shortcuts undermine credibility. Men are not moved by urgency rooted in fear. They respond to stability rooted in fairness. This difference in motivation explains why conversations often miss each other. As this gap widens, communication becomes harder. Each side speaks from different assumptions. One side appeals to emotion, the other evaluates outcomes. Without shared premises, dialogue stalls. Reestablishing shared premises would require acknowledging that men are rational actors responding to incentives. It would require discarding narratives that frame male withdrawal as pathology. It would require recognizing that peace is not something men stumbled into accidentally. It is something they earned by leaving environments that harmed them. Once that recognition occurs, possibilities open. Without it, stalemate persists. The reality is that many men are content to let the stalemate continue. Contentment removes leverage. When leverage disappears, demands lose force. This is why the future will not be shaped by debate alone. It will be shaped by behavior, by who shows up and who does not, by where people invest energy and where they withdraw it. Men have already cast their votes with their feet. The question is whether the systems they left will learn from that signal or continue to ignore it. At this point, it should be clear that what we are witnessing is not a temporary imbalance or a misunderstanding that can be resolved with better messaging. It is a structural shift rooted in incentives, experience, and adaptation. Men did not arrive here by accident. They arrived here by paying attention. They observed patterns, adjusted behavior, and discovered that life became calmer, simpler, and more manageable when they stepped away from environments that demanded constant sacrifice without stability. As global economic pressure continues to build, this shift will only intensify. Automation, rising costs, unstable employment, and shrinking margins force people to prioritize efficiency. In that kind of world, tolerance for unnecessary stress collapses. Men who have already optimized for low overhead and high autonomy are better positioned than those whose lives depend on fragile systems and emotional volatility. Automation also changes how value is measured. Physical presence matters less. Constant hustle matters less. Output and adaptability matter more. Men who have built skills, routines, and independence align naturally with this environment. They do not need constant affirmation. They need functional systems. When systems fail to function, they disengage. This creates a quiet divide between those who adapt and those who wait for conditions to improve. Waiting assumes someone else will fix the problem. Adaptation assumes responsibility for outcomes. Men increasingly choose the latter, not because they are heroic, but because it works. Another factor that will entrench the shift is the redefinition of success. Success is no longer assumed to include marriage, children, or traditional domestic structures. For many men, success now means control over time, freedom from unnecessary conflict, physical health, and financial stability. These goals are achievable alone. That matters. When success becomes achievable without social approval, social pressure loses power. Men stop measuring themselves against expectations that no longer align with their lived experience. They define their own benchmarks and pursue them deliberately. This is deeply unsettling for systems built on assumed male participation. When men no longer need validation, they cannot be steered by shame or obligation. When they no longer fear loneliness, they cannot be coerced by scarcity narratives. When they no longer chase approval, they cannot be managed through comparison. And what remains is choice, like voluntary participation, genuine alignment. These are harder to secure because they require mutual benefit, but they are also more durable. For women who understand this shift, the path forward is not bleak. It is simply different. Relationships that form under these conditions tend to be quieter, more intentional, and less performative. They are based on shared routines, mutual respect, and low drama interaction. They do not resemble the narratives promoted online, but they function far better in reality. For women who do not adapt, frustration often grows, demands increase, blame escalates. But blame does not create attraction, pressure does not create trust, and urgency does not rebuild peace. This is the central misunderstanding. Men did not leave because they wanted leverage. They left because they wanted peace. Peace does not negotiate. It either exists or it does not. Another reality that must be faced is that men are no longer motivated by rescue narratives. The idea that men will step in to stabilize society simply because things have become difficult assumes a moral obligation that has been systematically undermined. Obligation without respect is not sustainable. Historically, men stepped up during crises because they felt connected to the people and institutions they were protecting. That connection has frayed. Without connection, sacrifice feels foolish rather than noble. Men are not indifferent to hardship, they are indifferent to systems that dismissed them until help was needed. This is why calls for men to return often fall flat. They are framed as duty rather than opportunity. They are framed as necessity rather than partnership. Men hear these appeals and recognize the pattern. They respond by maintaining distance. A distance is not hostility, it is insulation. It is the boundary men built after learning repeatedly that proximity came with cost. As this insulation becomes normalized, society adapts around it. Policies adjust, markets adjust, cultural expectations shift. What once felt like absence becomes background noise. The system learns to function with fewer men participating in traditional ways. This adaptation reduces urgency for reform, which further delays meaningful change. The longer this persists, the more entrenched the new normal becomes. Some will argue that this trajectory is unsustainable, that society cannot function without men fully engaged, that pressure will eventually force a correction. But pressure only works on those who feel it. Men who have simplified their lives feel less pressure, not more. They have fewer obligations, lower costs, fewer dependencies. They are harder to move because there is less to threaten. Others will argue that loneliness will drive men back. But loneliness is not the defining feature of male solitude. Many men report the opposite. They report clarity, focus, and relief. Without constant tension, they rediscover themselves. Self knowledge is another stabilizing force. Men who understand themselves are less likely to seek external completion. They form relationships from abundance rather than need. Those relationships, when they occur, are more balanced. This challenges the idea that men are incomplete without partnership. Completeness changes the dynamic. It removes desperation. It removes tolerance for dysfunction. It raises standards quietly and firmly. Standards are often misunderstood as demands. They are not, they are filters. They determine what enters a life. Men have learned to filter aggressively because experience taught them the cost of not doing so. This filtering is not cruelty, it is care for self, it is boundary maintenance, it is the natural outcome of growth. As the world becomes more complex, more volatile, and more uncertain, these traits will become more common, not less. Simplicity will be prized, stability will be protected, Optionality will be favored. Men are not waiting for permission to live this way. They are already doing it. The remaining question is whether society will adjust to this reality or continue attempting to reverse it through pressure and narrative. Pressure will fail. Narrative will fail. Only incentive alignment has a chance. Incentive alignment means creating environments where men feel respected, protected, and valued. Not in theory, in practice. It means shared accountability. It means consistent standards. It means consequences that apply evenly. It means privacy, discretion, and restraint. These are not radical demands. They are foundational requirements for trust. Without trust, participation remains optional. And when participation is optional, people choose what benefits them most. Men have made that choice. They chose peace over approval, stability over chaos, autonomy over obligation. They chose to step back rather than fight a system that refused to change. This choice does not make them villains, it makes them adaptive. And adaptation always wins in the long run. As we close this discussion, it is important to reflect on what this means going forward. Not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a reality check. Systems that ignore incentives eventually lose participants. Relationships that ignore reciprocity eventually dissolve. Narratives that ignore biology eventually collapse. Men walking away is not the cause of these outcomes. It is the result. The door to reconnection is not locked, but it is no longer wide open. It requires effort, humility, and genuine reform. It requires meeting men where they are, not where they are expected to be. It requires offering peace rather than demanding sacrifice. Until then, men will continue doing what they have learned to do best: live quietly, think clearly, protect their energy, build lives that make sense to them, and they will do so without apology. Before we end, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what we discussed today? Do you agree with this perspective or do you see it differently? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts because this conversation matters and it affects all of us. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, Men Walking Away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.